So I thought I would talk about a topic that's close to, or maybe should not be as close on our minds as it is tonight. That is anti-Semitism. And I'm sure even the name kind of makes some of us cringe with discomfort. Haven't we heard enough of it, you may ask? I think not, hence I'm bringing it up. And how do we define it? When do we know that we're actually seeing it? Is Shylock, for instance, in The Merchant of Venice, is that play, is that moment, was Shakespeare an anti-Semite when he wrote it? Some say yes, others say no, and then the debates began. After all, if you're watching Patrick Stewart and David Suchet, you kind of get lost in it anyway. But either way, it definitely gives us pause. I've of course heard that the Shakespeare version of a Jew is really not that sympathetic, rather more like a villain out of a comic book where we kind of see Shiloh's case being really unique, and that here is this guy who's kicked on and he's spit on, and then he of course becomes this vengeful person. Yet if I understand if we can all kind of think through what might be anti-Semitism. Was the Holocaust anti-Semitism? You would say yes, arguably. And yet if you look in some of the mass media productions of books, it makes us wonder, really was, and are all of the books like The Tattooist of Auschwitz, which is a little bit more of a love story, is that still portraying what actually happened in an authentic voice? Or what about The Boy in the Striped Pajamas? Kind of makes us wonder. When you compare that to a truly dark survivor's memoir, such as Chill Rachman's The Last Jew of Treblinka, which I have to tell you was not a barn-selling book. It was in fact pretty dark, not full of compassion, but you can just see the pain oozing out of the pages. The troubling thing that I'm sure you've all figured out is, how do you define anti-Semitism? And there's been actually many attempts to define it, whether you are Emil Durkheim and his theory of anti-Semitism as a coping mechanism for the anomie caused by modern economic relations, or your Engels and his understanding of anti-Semitism as an expression of reactionary opposition to capitalist economic progress, or maybe your Sartre. In case you didn't know, I have a BA in philosophy. And in his analysis of anti-Semitism as a bad faith attempt to flee from responsibilities. Of course, looking at philosophers, you're going to get all sorts of responses. Maybe you want to look at Leon Pinsker's idea that anti-Semitism is a response to the abnormality of Jews being somewhere between a national existence and a lack of a real foundation for that existence. It's all over the map. When you look at the British historian Paul Johnson, who's cited by Barry Weiss in her book describing anti-Semitism, I think though this definition really hits it nicely, and that it describes anti-Semitism as a virus, actually something that's deeply rooted within Western culture, that unfortunately, just like any other virus, we carry so many in our bodies. After all, we just got through COVID, but you all have learned as a result of the pandemic what happens when our immune system isn't as strong. That nasty virus that was once dormant in our bodies are going to flare up and do, well, ugly things. And unfortunately today, anti-Semitism is flaring up, and we can kind of gather that maybe our society isn't quite as healthy as it once was. And then there's the, what do you do when you hear certain things about, certain myths, certain statements, as to why it is that some people just don't stand up. After all, even in our unity service, somebody said, look at the Jews, they're rich, and he informs his congregation and his people to do just like that. And I'll remind you that, in fact, Jews are not the richest minority. We are not. That belongs to the Hindus. We are just thought of as being rich. It's a medieval trope because we were associated with being moneylenders. There's also constant association and bickering. Is criticism of Israel anti-Semitic? Then you have to push forward and ask when and how, and context, of course, being super important. Is it okay to criticize what Bibi Netanyahu and his government is doing? I think so, yes. Is that anti-Semitic? No. But if you do so in the light and denigrate Israel above and beyond the denigration of any other nation, and you're overtly criticizing Israel, then it moves into the category of questionable and maybe yes. So again, when we look at what is anti-Semitism, Dara Horn in her book, People Love Dead Jews, by the way, super light reading, points out that anti-Semitism, unfortunately, we see in the left and the political right. We also see it in people's silence. But it's something not just beyond the silence, it's not just in the political right or the political left, where anti-Semitism can be found. Unfortunately, it can also be found in just simple language in how we communicate and talk about events. Deborah Horn does point out in the last chapter of her book about an incident in a Hasidic community where, unfortunately, there was a shooting and some people died. And how it was reported in the media was there was zoning battles between the Hasidic community and the non-Hasidic residents. My question though, and she brought it to my attention, is that's not necessarily how we portray and discuss municipal disputes. We don't describe them being settled with guns. Rather, we normally would have described this hate crime, if it had been somewhere else or perhaps to a different group of people, as simply that, a hate crime. So even language matters. And if you've gotten the feeling that it's a little bit complicated, you're right. It's not just a little bit, I would say it's very complicated in that it's everywhere and nowhere, and it's seen but not seen, and spoken about and yet not spoken about. And even among Jews, it's something that we're not exactly always comfortable with. I don't know if you've realized that there are sometimes Jews who will not necessarily even want to talk about it. They'll look at me and say, you know, I'm not really a particularly good Jew. I only come on the high holidays. That's, you know, of course, excluding all of you here. You're all amazing Jews. Or my family used to be really, really Jewish. Now we just don't keep kosher, and I don't really read Hebrew anymore. I can kind of follow along with the transliteration. So I don't necessarily feel quite so Jewish, Rabbi. And the best one is, what do I say when I'm told I'm culturally Jewish? Does that mean I'm any less Jewish? And of course, the answer to all of these questions in my mind is you're perfectly an amazing Jew. You're as Jewish as you want to be, as not Jewish as you don't. That still doesn't necessarily mean that you escape the criticism of anti-Semitism, though you may want to. It also doesn't mean that you can allow yourself the permission to not engage in the conversation. You're still part of the community. So I'll tell you one of the ideas that I've come up with, of course, it's to be out and proud as a Jew. Why not? Can't hide it. It's pretty much everywhere if you look on at least my social media feeds. And I'm sure for some of you, though, it's not. Some people don't want to be out and proud Jews. They don't even want to have their pictures taken in Hillel events or have their names published anywhere in Jewish organizations in 2023. That should make us all question. But what do? It's not like I necessarily have an answer, but I can say that why I think we should be more proud and embracing of our Judaism, maybe this should be that impetus to find ourselves more embracing of it, is that Judaism, at its core, I think, is countercultural. It forces you to, well, do things on Jewish time, meaning Shabbat, which is on a Saturday, not a Sunday. Though if you were the Reform movement in late 1800s, you may have tried to move it to Sunday, that whole thing failed. But it's on Saturday during soccer and other such things, and Friday nights. There's the idea that you're going to stand up and speak out for justice. They're going to be forced to look at things from various perspectives. Our rabbis modeled that in the Talmud. They did not want us to be monolithic in our viewpoint. They really wanted us to understand that there's more than one point of view. They wanted us and encourage us to walk in the pathway with God and to ultimately believe in a strong community. They push us to think about time not as a linear progression forward, rather more of a circular event tied to the agrarian cycles. We are supposed to act as if we were standing at Sinai, living into our tradition, reading about our tradition, engaging with our tradition in every possible level. We are taught that we should study text, not just study text. We're the people of the book. We're supposed to live in those texts, love on those texts, and allow them to nourish our very soul. For me, they have served frequently as my guides. And so when we look at how do we deal with anti-Semitism, recognizing that it's complicated, it's from the right, it's from the left, and we still debate where it comes from. And by the way, a good definition for it, I'll remind us that this is our chance to remain countercultural. Yay, we can still be independent and have our independent ideas. It's our chance to be different. And I'm going to push us a little bit on this one. How many of you have heard that your parents, or maybe you were told your parents changed their names when they came through Ellis Island? 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to break something open for you. That's a myth. In fact, the people who worked at Ellis Island were super, super well trained in what they did. They, in fact, usually spoke 2, 3, and 4 languages. Your ancestors' names had to match what was on the ship's manifesto, and if it did not match what was on the ship's manifesto, they were sent back to Europe at the expense of the captain himself, personally. Yay. It was in his best interest to make sure your name was consistent. What was discovered were court records found not long after people came into this country, where they petitioned to have whole family names changed. It's not that they decided not to join synagogues, but they really wanted all of their names to be, well, a little bit more American. It was their way of maintaining who they were. Don't forget what it was like in the early 1900s. It wasn't necessarily easy to be a Jew. There were signs posted in public places, no, you can figure out, no Jews and no dogs allowed. There were places that informed you through job applications that there were churches nearby as kind of a subtext, Christians need apply, Jews need not. And Sabbath observers not welcome in those same job descriptions. For them, for your ancestors, Jewish identity was something that they wanted to keep on the DL. They wanted to keep quiet. But again, I'm going to push us. Let's not do that. Let's not stay quiet. We have our neighbors who have stood up for us over the summer, have extended their outreach to us and came to an open Shabbat, and have continued to express interest in supporting us as we face an increasing amount of anti-Semitism. I'll remind you, for those of you who may not be aware, that over Rosh Hashanah, several Reform synagogues received bomb threats and swatting incidents. There were other congregations for whom hecklers came in, and I sat on a call earlier this week with over 400 Jewish professionals, along with members of the Secure Community Network, all describing and discussing what do we do with this growing number of anti-Semitic acts, and what does it mean? I spoke to the U.S. attorney who told me that he was at a conference last week talking about national security threats, and unfortunately, I will tell you, anti-Semitism is on that list. It's not a problem that's going away. Quite the opposite. It's a problem that's getting worse. And my response is be proud of who we are. We have our neighbors. Let's teach them what anti-Semitism looks like. If you learn from anything from the first part of my sermon, it's complicated. If it's complicated for us, it's going to be complicated for them. We need to have more educational moments to teach them how and when to speak on our behalf. Because the shutting down of anti-Semitism, unfortunately, it's not going to come from us. We're going to have to rely on our interfaith friends and partners to help us do that. So how do we keep going forward? Well, I have an outline of a t-shirt that we're going to start to sell that says, "Love thy neighbor is our faith." Yay! To encourage people in Macon to love our neighbors. We're going to continue to work with the Downtown Interfaith Tapestry to have more open house events, not just for us, but for all of the downtown congregations, and more conversations and educational moments about what is anti-Semitism, along with the interfaith trip that I described at the Unity service. I want to close with Deborah Littstadt's words, which appeared in the New York Times in a column a little over a week ago. "This shapes my ultimate wish on Rosh Hashanah. The Jews will respond to anti-Semitism by combining a relentless push against anti-Semites with an even more energetic pull toward their tradition in all of its manifestations. That they will respond by demonstrating pride in who they are and solidarity with others facing persecution for who they are. That it will be shaped by a sincere accounting of the beauty and power and wisdom of Judaism and its values. That this can serve as a model to other groups who face relentless hatred." May we find Deborah's words to be inspirational. May we have the energy to go forth, scream out loud, be proud, be energetic, function in community, and combat anti-Semitism with love.